J.D. Vance stood before the massive oak doors of the courtroom. A deep breath, and he entered. The room was cold and gloomy. The smell of old wood and cheap cleaning detergent hit his nose. Journalists sat on the benches, some already holding notebooks and recorders, as if they were waiting for a sensation. At the center of the room, elevated, sat Judge Jack, a tall, thin man with gray hair combed back. His black robe was perfectly pressed, and his eyes were as cold as ice. Jack was known for his uncompromising nature and sharp tongue. His decisions were often harsh, but no one doubted his professionalism. J.D. sat at the defense table. His suit was a little wrinkled from the long journey, but he paid no attention to it. He wasn't here for victory today. He was here for justice. Mr. Vance, Jack's voice sliced through the air like a knife. Do you understand the seriousness of the charges? J.D. calmly lifted his head. Yes, Your Honor. In that case, I hope you're not planning to waste my time with empty statements and emotional attempts at justification. Jack shot him a disdainful glance. J.D. noticed a few journalists exchanging glances, followed by muffled laughter. But he didn't react. Inhale, exhale. Calm and confidence, his best weapons. Mr. Vance, Jack leaned forward, his voice even sharper. Do you really think this court is a place for people like you? Or did you think it was just another episode of a political show? J.D. clenched his fingers on the table, but his expression remained impassive. I believe in justice, Your Honor, he replied evenly. And that's why I'm here. Jack smirked contemptuously. Let's see how long your faith lasts. J.D. felt a chill run down his spine. But he didn't allow himself to lose control. He didn't come here to prove anything to Jack. He came to prove something to himself. Prosecution, please begin, the judge announced. J.D. leaned forward, listening to the prosecutor's opening words. His heart beat evenly. His gaze remained focused. He knew this was just the beginning. But he was ready. J.D. Vance silently stared at the judge, trying to remain calm. A tense silence filled the courtroom, broken only by the soft crackling of the air conditioning system. Judge Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the table's surface with barely concealed disdain. Is that all? Jack smiled crookedly, fixing J.D. with a look full of self-assurance. I thought you'd have something more serious, Vance. Something substantial. But this looks like just another waste of the court's time. J.D. clenched his jaw, but his voice remained even. I believe the case deserves an objective review. The documents prove the existence of systematic violations. Violations. Jack grimaced, his eyes narrowing. Oh, let's not exaggerate. I've read your evidence, Mr. Vance. Weak material. I see no grounds for further consideration. J.D. met his gaze, feeling the tension in the room rise. The sense of injustice pressed on his chest. Judge Jack was acting as though the outcome had already been decided. Do you really think that the testimonies of 4 victims and the bank documents are weak material? J.D. didn't raise his voice, but there was firmness in his tone. Jack smiled wider. Are you trying to lecture me? In my court. J.D. felt several pairs of eyes turn to him. In the front row sat a young woman, one of the victims whose testimony was being considered today. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her sweater. In her eyes was a look of hopelessness mixed with fear. J.D. stepped forward, holding Jack's gaze. I just want justice for these people. Jack smiled even wider, leaning back in his chair. His fingers slowly traced the surface of the table. Justice? Do you really believe in that? In this world, the strongest survive, Vance. Open your eyes. I already have, J.D. replied calmly. He took another step forward. Judge Jack flinched, but quickly regained his indifferent demeanor. And what are you going to do? The judge sneered. J.D. paused for a second before saying, Keep going. Until the truth is clear to everyone. Jack laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. He leaned forward, his eyes flashing with coldness. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "I understand more than you think," JD replied. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and two men in sharp suits entered. One of them, a tall man with short cropped hair, held a folder with the Ministry of Justice's seal. "Judge Jack," the man stepped forward, his voice cold and official. "We have an order for your temporary suspension due to an internal investigation regarding abuse of office." Jack turned pale. His confident smile vanished, leaving only a shadow of confusion. "This is a mistake," he snapped, rising quickly, but the man with the folder had already handed him the document. JD didn't take his eyes off him. "You said that in this world, the strongest survive," JD said calmly. "But I've always believed that justice is stronger." Jack stood in silence as the two men took him by the arms. His eyes flashed with rage before he suddenly jerked free. "You'll regret this, Vance." JD remained standing in place as Jack was escorted out of the courtroom. An intense silence hung in the air, but somewhere in the front row, the young woman who had still been clutching her sweater raised her gaze. A spark of hope appeared in her eyes. JD took a deep breath and sat back at the table. This was just the first battle, but he knew the real fight was still ahead. JD stood by the window of his office, watching as the evening sun painted the rooftops of the neighboring buildings in copper hues. He held a cup of coffee in his hands, but the drink had long since cooled. His thoughts were far from the moment. They were in the courtroom, where he had won an important victory that day. The office door opened, and Sarah, his assistant and closest ally in legal matters, entered the room. She held a tablet in her hands, her eyes gleaming with both excitement and anxiety. "All the news is about this, JD," she said, handing him the tablet. JD glanced at the screen. The headline screamed about the courtroom scandal. "Judge Jack accused of corruption and abuse of power. Major courtroom revelation. Attorney Vance brought the case to a logical conclusion." JD ran a hand through his hair, feeling the tension gradually lift. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. Sarah sat on the edge of the desk, crossing her arms over her chest. "But we won. Isn't that enough?" JD shook his head. "Jack's suspension is just the first step. His contacts in the system are still active. His influence won't vanish overnight." Sarah paused for a moment before cautiously asking, "Do you think he'll start working behind the scenes?" JD looked out the window again, his gaze stopping on the dark silhouettes of cars speeding down the narrow city streets. "If he decides to retaliate, it'll be fast and without warning. Then we need to stay ahead of him," Sarah said confidently. JD turned to her, his eyes flashing with determination. "I'm already on it." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning?" JD set the coffee cup on the windowsill and walked over to the desk, pulling a thin folder from the drawer. "I hired a private investigator. He's been digging into Jack for a few weeks now, and it looks like he's found something interesting." Sarah moved closer, her eyes narrowing. "What exactly?" JD opened the folder, revealing several black and white photographs on the first page. They showed Jack entering a luxurious house accompanied by two men in suits. JD placed another photograph in front of Sarah. It showed the same men handing Jack a brown briefcase. "Money," Sarah guessed. JD nodded. "Most likely a bribe. But that's not all." He set the photos aside and pulled out a document with the financial department's seal on it. "This house is registered to a shell company that, as it turns out, is linked to the construction corporation Blackstone. And do you know who the major shareholder of Blackstone is?" Sarah tensed. "Don't tell me." JD nodded. "Jack's brother, Thomas Jackson." Sarah whistled. "So Jack was taking bribes to lobby for Blackstone's interests." "Exactly." JD sat in the chair, resting his hands on the desk. "They were covering illegal developments, using cheap materials, bribing officials. And Jack covered all of it in court." Sarah shook her head. "If this becomes public, Jack will end up in prison." JD smiled coldly. That's exactly what I'm planning to do. Sarah thought for a moment, then carefully asked, "And how are you going to pull this off?" JD glanced at the phone resting at the edge of the desk. The detective said he has recordings from hidden cameras. If we get them and hand them over to the press, it will be the end for Jack. "And when will you get these recordings?" JD looked at his watch. "Today." At that moment, the phone rang. JD picked it up. "Vance, it's me." The detective's voice sounded tense. "We have a problem." JD tensed. "What happened?" "They found out I was following them. Someone sent people to my office. They took the recordings." "What?" JD stood up. "But I managed to make a copy." The detective spoke quickly. "I'm in a safe place now. We can meet in an hour." JD gripped the phone tightly. "Where are you now?" "In an abandoned warehouse by the docks." "Bring someone with you. This could be a trap." The connection was cut off. Sarah stood up. "What happened?" JD grabbed his jacket quickly. "They know we've exposed them. We need to act immediately." Sarah nodded. "I'll go with you." JD hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's go." They left the office, descended to the underground parking lot, and got into a black sedan. JD started the engine, and the car jerked forward. Sarah fastened her seatbelt, her eyes gleaming with tension. "If it's a trap." JD gripped the steering wheel, his eyes focused ahead. "We'll find out soon enough." The car sped down the dark street, disappearing around the corner towards the docks. The black sedan raced through the city streets, skidding over the wet asphalt. JD gripped the steering wheel tightly, his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind was occupied with the conversation with the detective. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously drumming on the leather door trim. "If this is a trap, we're walking right into it," she said quietly. "I know," JD replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "But if we lose this evidence, Jack will remain untouchable." They sped through a red light at the intersection, causing angry honking from a few drivers. JD didn't pay attention. The adrenaline was pushing him forward. In 10 minutes, they were nearing the docks. The air was heavy with the smell of seawater mixed with the metallic tang of rusting iron. Tall cranes stood still against the gray sky, and rows of containers cast long shadows in the streetlight. JD slowed down as the car approached an old warehouse. The large metal doors were slightly ajar. Inside, darkness. "This looks bad," Sarah whispered, looking around. JD opened the glove compartment and pulled out a gun. Sarah glanced at him in surprise. "I didn't know you carried a weapon." "Not always," JD replied, checking the magazine. "But today is the kind of day when it could save our lives." He got out of the car, signaling for Sarah to stay behind him. She pulled out her phone and dialed a speed dial number. "If anything goes wrong," JD said, "run to the car and call the police." "I'm not going anywhere without you," Sarah replied firmly. JD sighed, then slowly opened the warehouse door. Inside was nearly pitch black, only a few weak bulbs flickered on the ceiling. The vast warehouse space was filled with wooden pallets, metal crates, and rusty containers. "Marty," JD shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Silence. JD cautiously moved forward, keeping the gun at chest level. Sarah followed, trying not to make any noise. Suddenly, something clattered in the darkness. JD spun around. Between the crates, he saw a silhouette. "Marty." JD repeated. "Here," came a faint voice. JD rushed forward. Behind a crate, in a pool of blood, lay Detective Marty. His shirt was torn, and a fresh knife wound was visible on his side. JD crouched beside him. "Shit. Marty, what happened?" Marty breathed heavily, his face pale. "They knew I was coming here. They were waiting." JD glanced at Sarah. "Call an ambulance." Sarah was already dialing. "Records?" JD asked, looking at Marty. "In my pocket," Marty whispered. JD reached into the detective's inner pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. They didn't find a copy, Marty whispered before his eyes closed. Hey. JD shook him gently by the shoulder. Hang in there, Marty. The ambulance is on the way, Sarah shouted. Suddenly, JD heard footsteps behind him. He swiftly raised his gun and turned around. Put the weapon down, Vance, a familiar voice said. JD saw two men in black suits with their guns drawn. Between them stood Jack, dressed in a perfect suit, with a cold smile on his face. Jack, JD rasped. You've gone too far, Vance, Jack said. You have something of mine. Hand over the flash drive, and maybe you'll stay alive. JD smiled. You think I'm stupid enough to believe you? Jack nodded to his men. One of them stepped forward, aiming his gun at JD. JD glanced at Sarah, who was slowly backing toward the door. He remembered the backup plan. You have 3 seconds, Vance, Jack said. Hand over the flash drive. JD sighed. You know, Jack, I have one bad habit. What's that? Jack asked, smiling. I never give up. JD dropped to one knee and shot the closest guard. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse, and the guard fell, clutching his leg. Jack retreated, and the second guard fired back. JD rolled behind a crate, bullets ricocheting off the metal walls. Sarah grabbed a pipe lying on the floor and hit the second guard in the head with all her strength. He fell unconscious. Jack pulled a gun from his pocket and aimed it at JD. This is your last mistake, Vance. I don't think so, JD said, pressing a button on his phone. Jack looked at him in surprise. At that moment, the sound of police sirens drowned out all other noises. Blue and red lights filled the warehouse. Shit, Jack whispered. JD smiled. I think this is your end, Jack. The warehouse doors were kicked in and armed police officers stormed inside. Drop the weapon. Get on the floor. Jack tried to run, but JD raised his gun and aimed it at Jack's knee. Don't move, JD said. Jack froze, then dropped his gun to the floor. The police rushed to him, putting handcuffs on him. JD stood up, wiping blood from his lip. Sarah approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. Do you think it's really over? JD looked at the flash drive in his hand. This is just the beginning. JD stood at the entrance to the warehouse, watching as the police led Jack to the car with flashing red and blue lights. Jack walked with his head held high, despite the handcuffs on his wrists. His cold smile was gone, but his gaze still held defiance. This isn't over, Vance, Jack shouted as the police were putting him into the car. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. JD silently watched as the patrol car doors slammed shut. The car drove off, and Jack's voice faded into the dull silence of the docks. Do you think he's right? Sarah asked, approaching JD. JD looked at the flash drive in his hand. Maybe, but right now it doesn't matter. Marty was carried out of the building on a stretcher. His face was pale, but he was conscious. The paramedic leaned toward JD. He's lost a lot of blood, but he'll make it. Good, JD replied, nodding. Marty opened his eyes and weakly smiled. Vance. That was risky. JD knelt beside him. You know me, I don't like the easy way. Marty coughed a laugh, but then groaned in pain. The flash drive. Keep it away from corrupt hands. It has everything needed to take them down. JD clenched the flash drive in his hand. I'll take care of it. Marty nodded and closed his eyes as the paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. JD and Sarah stood together as the ambulance, with sirens blaring, disappeared into the distance. What's on the flash drive? Sarah asked. Evidence of everything: bribery, money laundering, ties to politicians, contract killings. Enough to put not just Jack in prison, but the entire top tier of this operation. Are you going to hand it over to the police? JD looked at her and shook his head. No, too risky. There are still too many people in the department on Jack's payroll. So what are you going to do? JD looked at the flash drive, which gleamed in the light of the street lamps. I'll find someone I can trust, and I'll make sure it goes public. Once the truth comes out, they won't be able to hide it. Sarah nodded, looking at him carefully. And then what? JD looked into her blue eyes and smiled. Then maybe we can take a little vacation. She smiled back. On an island with palm trees and cocktails? JD shrugged. Maybe for a while, I'll even be able to afford a little peace. They stood side by side, watching as the night's darkness gradually faded, giving way to the pale light of morning. JD took a deep breath of the sea air and tightened his grip on the flash drive. But only for a while. He cast one last look at the docks, where their fate had been decided just an hour ago. Then he turned to Sarah. Let's go home. They got in the car, and JD started the engine. The motor rumbled, and the black sedan moved forward, disappearing into the dawn's light.